Good. All right, got it. Okay, the beginning of the 8th parak talks about a neder made, and there's a time element involved. Right? The Mishnah gives examples. If he makes a neder for a day, how long is a day? If he makes a neder for a month, makes a neder for a year. Right? We want to know what is the expiration of that neder. The Gemara on Samach Aleph asks a general question regarding the Yovel year. Okay, the Gemara is on 61a. Iboiluhu, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th line from the top. Iboiluhu, Amar Yain Shani Toam Yovel. Person says, right, he makes a neder, wine he won't drink up until Yovel. So depending on where he is in the cycle, he has the day to be Yovel when it's over. So the Gemara obviously wants to know what is the actual state of Yovel that year that Yovel occurs. Is that in the neder? Is it not in the neder? So the Gemara says the following: "My shnas chamishim kilifnei chamishim o kalachar chamishim." Right. So we have like in football terms, right? We like to use the 50-yard line. So whose zone is the 50-yard line in? So too over here is Yovel. Is the year of the Yovel considered part of the neder, or is it not? So because the Gemara brought this question, we have bigger fish to fry, so to speak, because the truth is when it comes to Yovel, there's a bigger question, and that is, how does Yovel work in the counting of years? Okay, what does that mean? Let's see the Gemara. Tashma Titania, Plukta Durab Yehuda Rabbanan. We're going to try to answer this question based on a general discussion we have between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. What do they disagree on? They disagree on a very, very important topic of Yovel, which is Yovel part of the count, or is it not part of the count? Meaning, we know that you have to count, the Torah says we have to count 7 sevens, and then is Yovel. So the Gemara comments on that and says, the Kidashta Meshnasa Chamishim Shana. It says that in the pasuk in Bahar, it says that we have to sanctify the 50th year. So the Gemara learns from here, Shnas Chamishim Atamona, the Atamona Shnas Chamishim Ba'achas. You count year 50 as part of the count, but year 51 is not part of the count. What does that mean? That means that year 50 is not part of the cycle. Okay? According to who? Well, let's see right now. Mikan Amru, Yovel Enu Ola Leminyan Shavua. Right? The question is, now we have the last Shemitah, year 49. Right? So let's pretend that we had Yovel today, and this year we know is a Shemitah year. Next year is going to be a Yovel year. So what happens the year after that, in 2 years? Do we start counting 1, and then the year after that is year 2? Or is the year after Shemitah, which is in this example, 2 years, is the Yovel itself year number 1? Obviously, this will throw all the calculations off. So that's what the Gemara over here is wondering about. The first opinion is Yovel does not count toward the counting of 7 years. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, absolutely it is. Yovel Ola Leminyan Shavua. Yovel does count for year 1. So according to the Rabbanan, the majority of the opinion, that 50 year, that Yovel is kind of like out of bounds. It's a year by itself that is not related at all to the Shemitah cycle. The years start after that. In Rabbi Yehuda's calculation, he includes that as year number 1. Okay, and the Gemara goes on and has questions Well, depending on who you hold like, then the Torah, we'll just do one example. Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbanan told Rabbi Yehuda, hey, harei omer sheshanim tizras adecha. The Torah says that what? 6 years. But according to you, the ein kan ela chamesh. According to you, if you count Yovel as another year, then you can't do work in Yovel also. So you have basically 2 Shemitas in a row. And then you have 5 years until the next Shemitah, not 6. Okay, so we get around that. And his answer is basically, well, sometimes it works, or most of the time it works, right? Once every 50 years, the pasuk isn't right. 6 out of 7 Shemitahs works, 6 years, then Shemitah. One of the year, you're going to have 5 because we're counting, right? Because we're counting that Yovel as part of the count. Okay, so that's the discussion, okay, between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim in our Gemara. So we spoke about Yovel about a year ago when we were doing Masechas Rosh Hashanah. We didn't speak about the Yovel per se. We spoke about the concept of blowing shofar in Yovel. If you remember, I like that topic very much. We had a discussion. For all those out there who remember, we were discussing the Jewish concept of Schadenfreude, right? About how we view the tsar from other people, and we spoke about how blowing shofar in the year of Yovel on Yom Kippur, the Sefer HaChinuch said. Yes, I did share that article. I do remember. The Chinuch mentioned that when people all are commiserating together, it's called Tzara Derabim, right? When everybody's upset that their slaves are leaving, because after all, the slaves leave at Yovel, so they blow the shofar, and it creates achdus amongst everyone, and nobody feels singularly depressed because everybody's in the boat together. And they all have to let their avadim go. And if you remember, the Sefer HaChinuch went into depths about how we see a very important concept that when we're all struggling together, it's the old misery loves company. So we spoke about Yovel there a little bit, but not so much as the concept, as much as we spoke about the actual blowing of the shofar, which is a mitzvah by itself, number 331. The number 330 is the actual mitzvah of Yovel. But before we get to the chinuch, it's very interesting how we're going to talk about Yovel, and believe it or not, I saw 5 different interpretations of what the word Yovel means. Okay, so we always start with Rashi. Okay, Rashi, I am in the beginning of Parshat Bahar. Okay, pasuk 10. It says, first the pasuk says that you have to count 7 years, 7 times, and you'll end up with 49 years. And pasuk Yud says, so what do you do on the 50th year? V'kidashtem eshnasa chamishim shana, ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, a famous pasuk, right, which happens to be, I think, the very last scene of the 10 Commandments, right, where they show on the screen there should be a freedom throughout the land. And then there's another on the Liberty Bell. It brings this pasuk also in the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Okay, so that's what the pasuk says. V'shavtem ish al chuzato v'ish al mishpachto tashuvu. Okay, and you should return, everyone. Return to your holding, and each of you returns to your families. The next pasuk 11 says, Yovel hishnas chamshim shanat yelachem lo tizra'u, you can't work, v'chulei. Okay. Okay. So what does Rashi say the word Yovel means? Shanaza muvdeles misha'ar shanim b'nekivat shem la levada. It should be a Yovel unto you. So Rashi stresses the word is muvdeles, distinguished. This year is distinguished from all other years, and it has a special name all to it by itself. And what is the name of the year? It's called Yovel. Why Yovel? Because Yovel is a reference to Al Shem Tekiyah Shofar, the sounding of the shofar. So Rashi says this is a separated year. Let's look at the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says Yovel. What does Yovel mean? It has nothing to do with separation. It has to do with Kumo Shiluach. The word Yovel, the taich, the interpretation of the word Yovel means Shiluach. It means sent away. Okay? So, and he quotes a pasuk from Yehoshua that says, Yovel keves v'haraya shofros hayovlim v'nikra shema b'shem shofar. Right? It says shofrat hayovlim, pasuk in Yehoshua. So that means that the Yovel is compared to a lamb, which is like it's sent away. So that's what the Ibn Ezra says. The Ramban says very simple. The words of the Ramban says, I'm in pasuk 10. It says, "Ulufi daiti lo karu akasav Yovel al hatikia rak al hadror." We're not focusing on the shofar or the animal per se. It's more focusing on the freedom. Kilo hiskir Hashem hazeh because of Harishon. Okay, the Ramban gives a reason, but to him, the key of the word Yovel is very simple. One word: freedom. Okay. Now, those are the big three. So, if you look in more recent commentators, there's a beautiful word from. There's a beautiful interpretation from someone I like to quote a lot, which is the Sefer Haksav HaKabbalah, the Ksav HaKabbalah of Mecklenburg. He says the word Yovel. He always does this with words. I don't know if you remember when we had the introduction to Yevamos. He said that the root of the word Yibum is the word bum in it, Beis Mem. So he does something similar over here. He says the word Yovel, he says, V'hu mishoresh balal, kumo blulos bashamin, right? It's mixed together, right? Like regarding the mincha, which is mixed with oil and flour. What does mixing have to do with Yovel? He says beautifully, Ki bishnasa Yovel yesh bilbul, the era of Reshuyos. Algemein, he says in Yiddish. It's like a mixture. It's a mixture of properties. Sheyitbalel seder harashuyos besados va'avadim v'hayahakona kahamocher. Everything goes back. So you have the kona becomes the mocher. Eved adono. The eved is like his master. Shifcha kgvirte. The shifcha is like her master, right? Kenosha kasher noshabo. The malve, right? The love becomes the malve. Everything gets all mixed up. Right, he says, "Cherus achas urishus echad lekulam." Ein kedima ve'ichor. There's no front, there's no back. It's all one big mix. I thought that was a very beautiful interpretation of the word Yovel from the word Balul. And finally, if you look the Hemek Davar, the Netziv, he says it comes from the word Huvla. L'fi hapshad hu milashon Huvla mimakom l'makom. The pashut pshad of the word Yovel. It comes from the word huvla, which is moving from one place to another place. And he proves it. He says, Ube'emes ken ayil nikra Yovel. An ayil, right? A ram is also called Yovel, right? As we know from the pasuk, because it's always going, mishum sheholech tamid b'makom l'makom. It's going from one place to another places. Okay? So that's just off the bat, we see several different interpretations of what the word Yovel actually means. Now, in order to understand the deeper meaning behind Yovel, so we're going to look in the Sefer HaChinuch, who gives a very famous interpretation or a famous understanding of what Yovel is all about. Okay, so let's look in number 330. 330 says, Mishar Sheha Mitzvah, right? The root of this commandment of Yovel, outside Hapshat, Sharatza Hashem Yisbaruch Lahodia La'amo Ki Hakol Shalom. This is something that we all know, or at least learned once, that Yovel is a notion that God wants to tell his people, a reminder, send them a memo that everything, in fact, belongs to him. Okay? Ki Hakol Shalom Ul Besof Yashuv Kol Davar Lasher Chafetzu litna b'tchila. Right? In the end, everything goes back, right, to who he gave it at first. Kilo haaretz, because the earth obviously belongs to God, right? Like the pasuk says, Kili kol haaretz, right? He said the pasuk says, Kili kol haaretz, and that's the introduction of the Sefer HaChinuch. He then goes on to explain the another explanation that we also heard of, the inyan zeh shel Yovel domek tzas lama shenahog lasos b'malchusa da'ara shalokchen adamos mizman lezman ma'ari habtzuros asher l'sareim. He compares it to these cities, right, where you have a king, and the king takes the land from the cities that are owned by private landowners every once in a while, lahazkir lahem yiras ha'adon, to remind them that in fact, hey, there's some king. Right, this is like we have like a 99-year lease, right? A 49-year lease, right? Today they have properties today that are almost yours, but not exactly yours, right? They do it just as a reminder to say that, yes, you're the tenant, but, once in a while, you should remember that nothing really belongs to you. That's what the chinuch is basically saying over here. He says, "V'chen hadavar hazeh sheratza Hashem sheyashu kol karka la'asher lo achuzar haaretz," right? Mimenu baruchu v'chen kol eved ish yatsa mitachat yado v'yebirshus boro. The truth is, you may think that you own a slave, but in reality, you don't own anything. Right? The slave goes back; he leaves you because, after all, you're not considered the ultimate owner. Okay, so that's basically what he says, and he gives another. As he continues, he gives another mystical reason. He says that there's a secret in the number 50, and all of the days and the years of the world are somehow hinted to in this number. We're not going to get into that. That's a little bit above our head. But there's all kinds of, if anybody has ever studied the Zohar, we know that the number 7, why there's 7 days in a week, why there's 7 this, why there's, right? 7 is a very common number, right? 7 sevens. You have it by Sfiras HaOmer, right? So not for now, but there's many comparisons between Sfiras HaOmer and counting the Yovel, right? So on and so forth. So let us, now that we at least defined Yovel and see this hidden reason why Yovel is so important, let's get back to our Gemara. Our Gemara basically had a discussion, or rather an argument, on how do you view the 50th year? Is it a year in solitude? And after the Yovel, we start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Or is year 50 really considered year 1? So the truth is that there is a sifra, there's a medrash in the beginning of Bahar, and the medrash reads like this: Minayin sheyispor l'shnei hashavua. How do you know that we count the years of the 7 shmitas? Okay, Talmud Lomer v'hayu l'cha yemei sheva shabsos shanim, because the pasuk says you should have 7, right? 7 times, right? 7 shmitas. Minayin sheyispor l'shnei Yovel. Right? How do we know that we count the years of the Yovel? Talmud Lomar v'hayu l'cha teisha v'arba'im shana. Okay, because from the word of the pasuk it says for 49 years. Minayin asay shviyas apal pisha ein Yovel. So here's an interesting question. So the Torah goes out of its way to link Shemitah and Yovel. Obviously, they're linked because at the end of 7 sevens you have Yovel. But the Medrash asks the question: Minayin, how do you know? Asay Yovel afal pisha ein shviyas. How do you know that you should still celebrate a Yovel even if you don't have Shemitah? See, that's something that we didn't think about, or if anyone talked about. Meaning, what if the Jews didn't do a Shemitah, let's say previous to a Yovel? Does that mean that we completely eradicate Yovel because we weren't Mekayem, the mitzvah of counting 7 Shemitah years, 7, 14, 21, 28, because we missed one. So the Medrash says, Talmud Lomar Tesha Ba'Ebeim Shana, Diva Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Talmud Lomar V'Hayu Lacha Sheva Shapsos Shanim. Therefore, the pasuk says, right, you should still have Shemitah even if you don't do Yovel. Okay, that's what the Medrash says. It's twofold. It's we do Shemitah even if we skip Yovel, and we do Yovel even if we skip Shemitah. Now we're going to see there's certain criteria that you have to do Shemitah and certain criteria that you have to do Yovel. Has to do with the Jews being, in the Gemara alluded to it, that the Jewish population has to be living in Israel, and certain things have to happen in order for us to celebrate Yovel, which is why today we don't have Yovel, but we do have Shemitah. So the Medrash says that what? If we don't have Shemitah, we still do Yovel, and if we don't have Yovel, we still do Shemitah. That is Diva Rabbi Yehuda. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim agree partially, and they say Shvius Noheges Afal Pisha Ein Yovel. Shvius we do like today, even though there is no Yovel anymore for whatever technical reason. How about the opposite? V'hayovel eino nohag ela im ken yeshimo shvius. But Yovel we don't do unless it's accompanied by shvius. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we still either do one or the other. One doesn't hold back the next. According to the Chachamim in the Medrash, okay, it does. Yovel, we don't get the opportunity to celebrate Yovel unless all of the Shemitahs are done in succession. So the question is that Medrash a coincidence that our Gemara brings the same machlokas? So if we don't think about it, we're going to say, well, what does it have to do with the 50th year? What does it have to do with the 50th year being included of the count or not included of the count? So it's close, but let's try to put this Medrash together with this Gemara and see if the Rabbi Yehuda mentioned in the Medrash happens to be the same Rabbi Yehuda mentioned in Nedarim. So in order to answer that, we have the help of the Malbim. I found the Malbim on this, and the Malbim says the following. The Malbim says, Lachen darshu mizeh shechelkam akasov l'shnei misparim. The Torah goes out of its way to tell you two separate things. First of all, we have Shemitah, which you have to do every 7 years, and there's a mitzvah of counting 7 Shemitahs to get 49. Then there's a separate concept of Yovel, which happens after the 7th Shemitah. Okay, so that's very important. So those are the words of the Malbim. He says, "V'hotzi rabim mizeh debayla mimnei yom." I'm sorry. Next line. Lachen darshu mizeh shachalkam akasov l'shnei misparim lilmod sheyisaper echad below hasheni. Right, 2 independent counts. Shemitah below Yovel. You should count Shemitah forgetting about Yovel's sake, and Yovel below Shemitah. And you should celebrate Yovel even if for whatever reason you don't celebrate Shemitah. Now, why would you not keep Shemitah? Meaning, what would have to happen? So the Malbim actually brings a Tosfos in Maseches Erechim that says, for whatever reason the Jews sinned, right? And they didn't do Shemitah, which, by the way, happens to be part of the Tochacha as to why bad things happened to the Jewish people was because they didn't keep Shemitah. That's a separate discussion, but that happens to be true as to why we were punished at certain times for not keeping Shemitah. Right, the psukim at the end of Bechukosai and the Tochacha go into depth about that. Not for now. Okay, so therefore the Malbim says, "Ulachen chalkam b'safarta sheva shabsos shanim." The Torah says, count 7 sevens. He's Sfiras Hashmitas. You should count the 7 Shmitas. Then, independent, the next pasuk says, once you counted 7 Shmitas, 7 times 7 equals 49. He's Sfiras HaYovel. That is called Sfirat HaYovel. Zedas Rabbi Yehuda. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says that Yovel is a separate calculation than Shemitah. Zedas Rabbi Yehuda, Vedas Chachamim. But according to the Chachamim, the Chachamim, now he's going to bring our Gemara in the Nedarim. So the Chachamim, Shehagam Shezeh Mavur Shesfirat Hashmitos Ain't Tluyin BeYovel. The Chachamim who say that what? Who say that Shmitas don't necessarily have to do with Yovel, but what did he did say? He says, Abal HaYovel Toloi B'Shmitos. But the Yovel depends on Shemitah. Okay, not to get too confusing, right? Almost like if we're not, right, we're not Zocha to celebrate Yovel if we don't do the 7 Shmitas. That's why it says, that's why it says 7 sevens, Hainu Dafka Imana Shmitos. That's only when you count Shmitos. So what do we see from here? And I found actually, so now that was the words of the Malbim, and the Meshech Chachma actually links the two together. He says, Shakulan kol atesha v'arba'im shana hen enam yovlim, u'shnas chamishim, only the 50th year is Yovel. The kol zehu the Rabbanan. The Yovel has nothing to do with Shemitah. So it's outside of the 49, according to the Rabbanan. Avala Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, lo nucholomar ken. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we can't say this to who Savar, because he holds, as the Gemara in Nedarim says, the Shnasa Yovel Ola Minyan Chamishim, right? Oh, I'm sorry, Ola Minyan Hashanim. Yovel actually counts as part of the years. So therefore, the Imken Bahanach Tesha V'Arba'im Shana. So when you count 49 years, what's year number 1 in Rabbi Yehuda's land, right? In Rabbi Yehuda's world? Year number 1 is actually Yovel. So Yovel is included in those 49 years. Beautiful, and that's exactly what our Gemara says. Bahanach Tesha V'Arba'im Shana Hashana Rishona Hu Yovel. Ubehema Hema Hem Shavim. So that's exactly how the Meshech Chachma, with a little help from the Malbim, explains how these two independent sources, the Medrash and Nedarim, actually bring down the same Rabbi Yehuda is Lishitaso, right? That Rabbi Yehuda is Lishitaso, that you could have one without the other, because the truth is that Yovel itself is year number 1 of the 49, and according to the Rabbanan, it's in no man's land. We don't count it according to the Rabbanan. That's why it's special. We only get the opportunity to celebrate Yovel if, right, we get the right Shemitah cycles in order, 7 of them. So I thought that was a very beautiful connection between the Gemara in Nedarim and the Sifra, the Medrash in Parshas Bahar. Okay, so that was what I wanted to say about that. There's a couple of side notes. I just wanted to end with a bigger question of, so why isn't there no Yovel today? Right? That's a great question. We do have Shemitah, as we know, people in Israel are celebrating Shemitah, but why is it that there is no Yovel? So I want to read one source. This is a source that comes from a very, very obscure Masechta. It's called Meseches Avadim. Believe it or not, there's a Masechta called Avadim. It's one of the, what we call minor tractates that are hidden in the back of Meseches Avodah Zarah. And Meseches Avadim, the very, very beginning of Avadim, talks about the Eved Ivri, and it mentions the following. Me'ematai pasku hayovlos. This is of Avadim, the very first Mishnah, Meseches Avadim, says, when did Yovel stop? Misha'ala Pul Melech Asher, when Pul, okay, the king of Assyria, together with the Tiglas Palneser, right, and Tiglas Pileser, right, they were the two kings of Ashur, V'Higla L'Ruveni, V'Lagadi, V'Chetzeves Hamanashi, right? A little history, the very first tribes that were sent away into Galus were the 2.5 Shvatim that were living on the other side, which is Reuven, Gad, and Chetzi Sheves Menashe. So when they left, that kind of blew the whole concept of Yovel. Why is that? because we know that it has to be when the Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. And after they were kicked out, there went Yovel. And there's a very, very long Rambam in the 10th chapter that goes into, I don't know how much, we'll read a little bit. The Rambam actually, if you've ever seen the 10th chapter of Hilchos Shemitah the Yovel, the Rambam goes through exactly how many Yovels, and he goes through the whole calculation of when Shemitah started. And there was, after Yehoshua brought the Jewish people into the land of Israel, after the 14th year, then is when the whole calculation started. I'm just going to read it in English for time's sake. So the Jewish people counted 17 Jubilee years from the time they entered Eretz Yisrael until they departed. Okay, so 17 times 50. The year they departed, when the temple was destroyed the first time, was the year following the sabbatical year and the 36th year in the Jubilee cycle. If you go back and do the math, so you break the 50 into pieces, and the remainder is 36, and he proves it. Right, so the first temple stood for 410, and then the land was desolate for 70 years, as we know, from the Gullus. And then the second temple was built, and it stood for 420 years. All right, and he goes through that, and he says that from this year, they began another reckoning. They designated the 13th year of the second temple as the sabbatical year and counted 7 sabbatical years and sanctified the 50th year. Right, although the Yovel was not observed in the second temple, they would count it in order to sanctify the sabbatical year. So, as we mentioned before, it's part and parcel, so to speak. You have to be makadesh the years by observing Yovel, so to speak. Even though the Rambam says it wasn't observed, it was still counted. And then the next law in the Rambam says it follows that the year in which the second temple was destroyed, beginning from Tishrei, it was 2 months after the destruction, the reckoning of the sabbatical and Jubilee years, blah, blah, blah. He says, according to this reckoning, this year, which is the 1107th year after the destruction, which is the 1487th year, whatever it is, the Rambam says that in the year 4936 after creation, right, we're now in 5783. Anyways, the Rambam goes into the actual numbers. So if you want to look into the details of how this whole thing worked, Rambam, the 10th chapter, goes into details. So I thought that was interesting for all those who want to go check that out. So that basically does it for the first half. I wanted to pick, this happens to be Daf Samach Vav, we're going to skip. It happens to be one of my top 3 or 4 blots in all of Shas because it has stories. You see, it's very interesting agadata that sometimes we have this agadata that we can't really relate to because there's stories of sea monsters and all kinds of miracles or refuahs and medications that we don't have today. So a lot of the agadata we can't really relate to. This agadata happens to be agadata that is like mundane, everyday life between husband and wife that I think we could all relate to. And it touches on at the end, we'll see a very interesting topic, which is a topic within itself that I've seen a number of places called humor in the Talmud, right? Whether or not these rabbis that we learn about all the time, as holy as they were, whether there was a lighter side to them and how they dealt with everyday occurrences that were funny, okay? And, to make it a little bit more personal to us, rather than to think that everything was holy and everything was beyond our grasp and all these stories, there's a lot that we could actually, I think take in. So let's look at a couple of stories. The springboard for this is the last Mishnah of the 9th Perek on 66a on the bottom, talks about a person who made a neder about marrying a certain girl. Right, the Mishnah said that Konam Shani no says Plonis. I am on 66a, the second wide line, okay, which is right in the middle of a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that a person makes a neder not to marry a certain woman because she's ugly. Okay, and he was mistaken. she's beautiful. I guess the picture came out bad on Facebook, and it came out that she was beautiful. Shchora v'harehi levana, or it was told to her that she was black and she was really white. We're not going to comment on that. Ktsara v'harehi arucha, short and she was long, meaning tall, right? Mutter. So we say it's mutter. No, the Mishnah says El Sheneder Tos. That's an example of, it's almost like those Nedarim, which we learned about a month ago, that if you had the wrong information and you based it off something that was wrong, so because your premise was wrong, we call that a Neder Tos. So now that we're talking about Nedarim that a man makes regarding something personal about either his wife-to-be or his current wife, let's look at the Gemara on the next daf. Okay, the Gemara on the next daf is 66b. Okay, there. Let's look at the first story. There's a few stories I want to read because, like I said before, these are unbelievable stories, and this is actually the daf on Friday coming up. Okay, so says the Gemara on 66b, the 7th or so line. The Gemara says, Hahuda Amr La Ledvisu, on the 5th line, I'm sorry, a person told his wife, Konam Shiyat Nehanesli Atititami Tavshilech al Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Shimon. So it seems that a husband was not very fond of his wife's cooking. So he got angry at her one day and said, you can't get any hana from me until you take this food and have the leading 2 rabbis of the generation taste it and see if they like it. Meaning he didn't think the food was very good. So he's like punishing her and saying, listen, I don't like it. If these 2 rabbis say that they like it, then okay. So he put her up for the test. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda time. Rabbi Yehuda tasted it. Now, we don't know whether he liked it or not, but Rabbi Yehuda was able to tell from this conversation that she was going to be in hot water if he didn't taste it. Because the question is, are these 2 rabbis expected to do something that's not rabbinic of them, right? Like today, for example, if you had something like this occur and you go to the leading 2 rabbis of the generation, it would be a bizayon, right? For these rabbis to taste your food to settle a score with your wife, right? Who would have the audacity or the chutzpah to do this in the first place? And secondary, would the rabbis themselves taste the food to see if in fact she's a good cook? So believe it or not, Rabbi Yehuda said to himself, you know what, I'm going to lower myself and I'm going to taste this food. And here was the reason of Rabbi Yehuda. Amr, he said, Kal v'chomer. Uma lasot shalom bein ish leishto, Amr Torah shemisha nichtav b'kedusha yimacha al mayim hama'orim b'safek. He said, I'm going to take the strategy that the Sota has. The Sota, in order to prove her innocence, has to go and to the Beis Hamikdash, and they have to have a whole procedure where the Kohen takes the Megillah and writes the Parsha Sota from Parshas Naso, and then puts the water on it, right? And it gets erased. So in effect, what we're doing is we're taking the name of God and we're erasing it. Now we know that usually that's not a good thing to do. That's a sinful, to say the least. To erase the name of God is not a good thing. But yet, the Gemara over here says that God is telling us that this sin could help what we call shalom ben ish leishto, right? What we call today shalom bayis. This could prove her innocence, and they could live, theoretically at least, happily ever after, if we let the name of God be expunged. V'ani alachas kam v'kama. So if that's allowed, if we're allowed to violate a tremendous sin, right, by erasing God's name, so certainly I, Rabbi Yehuda, can lower myself, which is not a sin like erasing God's name, lower myself, okay, and through a bizayon of tasting a total stranger's food, right, and making sure that, this couple gets back together. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Yehuda said. Rab Shimon lo time. Rab Shimon said, no dice. I ain't tasting it. Amar Yamusu kol b'nei almana. He got very angry. He took the exact opposite. He had the opposite reaction. He said, forget about it. Let them, right? Let them go to Gehenna, right? Let them all burn. I am not tasting food, right? It's a curse that they have the chutzpah, to even put me in this situation, which this is kind of the reaction that most people would have. And I'm going to show them, I'm going to teach them a lesson, because you shouldn't even be making a neder in the first place, right? We know that when it comes to the sin of Nedarim, it says the wife dies and the children die. So, me helping settle a score here by tasting the food is almost like aiding and abetting, right? The sin that's taking place right in front of my eyes, says Rab Shimon. So I thought that was, kind of wild story about how, shalom bayis, right? Shalom bayis is a very, very important thing. And at least let's be positive here, the glass half full, and let us, focus on the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that shalom bayis, we have many Gemaras that talk about how great shalom bayis is. And this is just another one. And we learn it from the very simple, strange / humorous story about a fight between a husband and a wife, how Rabbi Yehuda, this is the Rabbi Yehuda, the leading, right? He was the leading rabbi of his generation. He stooped low just to prove a point of how important shalom bayis is. So I think this is a great lesson. I'm not saying that this story should be duplicated. I'm just saying that sometimes the Gemara wants to prove a point, and it takes a very, very odd source to prove it from, and this certainly is a very odd story. So that's one story for the books. We're going to look at a second one now. Okay, the second one is if you
That's a question, Jonathan.
Sure.
A quick question. But the story that follows it talks about Rabbi Shimon. And why do they place it there? Because it's the exact opposite. He says, I'm not going to lie.
Right.
So how do you explain that? Why did they give that story there?
Why? Because there's always going to be a second opinion.
Okay.
Meaning you're going to find the greatest two rabbis, and you see how divergent they are. Right. One of them said basically go to hell. Right. Okay.
That's what he said.
Practically. And the other one said, I'm going to take one for the team. Okay. And this is very par for the course. We see how one story could produce two completely divergent opinions. It's very, that's also fascinating. And these two are similar, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, these were the two leading, rabbis of the generation. So we have a better story, right? We have one great story after the other. And here's a better story. I am reading, it's basically halfway down, about, 15 lines or so in the middle. Another case of a husband and wife. The husband makes a neder, and he says, Konam she'iyat nehenesli ad shetire mum yafeh shebachal Rabbi Yishmael b'Rabbi Yossi. So he wakes up one day and he realizes, okay, that this wife of his has no redeeming features. Okay, and he gets so angry that he says, I'm going to make a neder and you can't have hana from me. Go find me one redeeming feature about you from the rabbi. Go have a rabbi examine you. Now, we use the word mum over here. There are commentators over here that say the word mum, which usually means blemish, doesn't mean a blemish over here. The Marsha says it does mean a blemish. It's like a good blemish. So there's different ways of learning this word mum, but the majority of the commentators say that it means from the word something. That's what the word mum means. So he basically said, find me something about you that's somewhat redeeming. And then I will, let this neder go. So Amar Lahem, so they told the story to Rabbi Yishmael, And they said, well, Shema Rosh Hashanah. So let's start from the top. Let's look at her head. Is her head shaped nicely? Amrullah, they said, no, Sagalgel. It's rounded. No good. It's a round head. Shema Sarana. So let's go down. Let's look at the hair. Is her hair worthy of praise? So they answered, Doma Lanitze Pishtan. Now, again, is it nice for this rabbi to look at the woman? Okay, obviously the commentators say what they do, whether Rabbi Shmuel actually saw or whether there was someone there who was reporting. We don't know exactly what, but either way, they're examining her. And when it comes to the hair, it's like flax, like very thick. It's not, she doesn't have good hair. Shema Eineha nos. Let's look at her eyes. Are they beautiful? No, true toes hang. They are rounded. Okay, they're like, I don't know, like the Mongolians, right? If you ever see their face, right? They have rounded eyes. Shema Azneha nos. How about her ears? Are they beautiful? No, kfulosen, they're bent. Shema Chotmana. What about her nose? Is her nose nice? No, bolumbu. It's like Miss Piggy. Shema Spaseha nose. What about her lips? No, avosen, they're very thick. Okay, this is not a politically correct Gemara, as you could see and we'll see further. Again, this is just reality. So I apologize if anybody is offended, but we're just interpreting. Shemet Savarana, what about her neck? How's her neck? So we say shakadhu. No, it's shakud, it's very short. Shema Kresana, what about her belly? Tzavahi. No, she's bloated, she's fat. Shema Ragleha knows, what about the legs? Rachobos Kishal Avza, they're thick as geese legs. Okay, so they basically went from top to bottom and couldn't find any redeeming features about her. So here's the punchline. Shema Shmana, maybe she has a beautiful name. Lachluchis Shma. Her name was Lachluchis. Now, if anybody speaks Hebrew, the word Lachluchis means dirty. So for whatever reason, her name is Lachluchis. So nothing is redeeming about her. And to boot, she's got a name which basically describes everything about her.
It's the Hebrew name for Cinderella.
Ah, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Lichluchit. Okay, there must be some Lashon Sagi Nahar there. So, Amar Lahen, so why is this the punchline? Because they finally found something redeeming about her. Her name fits her characteristics. She is so filthy with mumin that the only thing good about her is that her name fits her 100%. The Sharyeh, and they found a way out of the net there. So that's the story. So I want to read to you the Ben Yehoyada. The Ben Yehoyada has a very interesting commentary on this story. Umasha Amar Shezeh Hashem Yafela. What does that mean that her name suits her? Nirali hakavana dahaya pitchon pelaba alomar lo samti daiti lihistakel ba lirot muminela. So the Ben Yehoyada takes the stance of, okay, let's go back in time, meaning they're married already in the story. So everybody at this point, after hearing the story for the last 5 minutes, should say, hold on a second, is this guy blind? Meaning he wakes up one day, he realizes that there's nothing nice about his wife, and he starts this whole process. So didn't they date? Didn't they see each other? Right? So the Ben Yehoyada explains that what's going on over here is that the husband, okay, had a out. What do you mean? He could have said, well, when we were dating, I didn't see her all the way. I wasn't looking. I don't know. Whatever the reason is, I didn't notice that. And what's he claiming now? So now we go back to the beginning of Ksubas and says, hold on a second. This is not what I bought. I have what they call a mekachtos. So you know what's redeeming about her? her name. What does that mean? The only thing that she has to support herself is not that she has a great quality and that her name describes her. That's for the humor side of this. It's that's her defense that her husband can't claim that I got a raw deal over here. If he, let's say, he never saw her while she was dating, Vada higidulo shma, they certainly told her name. The kivan sheshama Hashem meguna zeh. So when they sent him an email that says, "Hey, we have a bride for you. Her name is Lachluchis," he should have said, "What? What kind of name is Lachluchis? That's a gross name." So because he heard this name, Vada yavin shenikras b'shem zeh al lichluch sheyesh ba. The reason why her name is Lichluch is because she, in fact, has nothing redeeming about her. V'hayalo lishol ma. He should have said, reply, hey, that's a very odd name. Can you tell me exactly how she got this name? But he didn't bother. He just took the name for granted. And now they say, how come you never ask the question why she has this weird name? Right? So we say, who the afsira nafshe? He ruined it for himself. And now he's stuck with this Nebuch. Nimsa Shemzehu Yafela. This name is pertinent to her. Ki alidei Shemzeh haisa nutzeches es habaal im hayaba betaina acher kiddushin. So the only thing that saved, right, her fanny is the fact that she has a name that he knew about. He may not have known of anything else. The only thing that he did know was he had a name that described her, and yet he committed to marrying her. So now, as they say, he is stuck with her. So that's the way that Ben Yehoyada explains what does it mean that now she has a redeeming quality about her. I found that very, very beautiful. And on that note, we have one last story, which is my probably top 3 stories in all of the Talmud, because it is so, on the one hand, it's funny, and we're going to see that at the end, there's a great musar, and it's a beautiful story that goes from that goes from slapstick humor to one of the most important character traits that Jewish people should have, and it's all encapsulated in one story. And here it is. Hahu bar Bavel. I'm about 10 lines or so from the bottom of 66b. There was a person who came from Bavel to Salak la'Arad Yisrael, and he ended up settling in the land of Israel and Nasav Itza. So he married an Israeli girl, but he came from Bavel. Why is this important to know the geography? Because as we're going to see, words spoken in different languages could mean different things. We have this all the time where you say a word, you're not sure what it means, and some guy's laughing at you because you say it wrong, right? We have these examples all the time. So this is how it played out. So when they were married, after they were married, right after the Sheva Brachos, the day after, Amarla, he said, B'shilili trei talfe, please cook for me 2 polkas. Talfe are like hooves of an animal. Bashole trei talfe. There's actually a machlokes what they got wrong. The Ran says that she got the quantity wrong. Okay, the Rashi and the Rush and others explain that she actually got the food wrong. So either way, she got something wrong about the order that the husband put in, right? She wanted a polka, he gave her lentils. Okay, so Rasachale, he got angry at her. The next day he said, right, at least according to the Ran, where he didn't get enough, right? When you say lentils, and she came back with 2 lentils, it's like tiny, right? No one has a meal of 2 lentils. It's like 2 pieces of rice. So he said, okay, I'm going to make up for it. I'm going to ask for a lot. So he wanted a grui, which is a large amount, and she did exactly what, like a whole bushel's worth of food she made for him, because he was trying to overcompensate for the 2 lentils he got yesterday, and now he had food for 20 people. So he wasn't happy. Amallah, he said to her, Zili Isili Trey Butzny, get me 2 melons. Azlava Isili Trey Shragi. Another explanation of the word butsine in Aramaic, it means melons, but it also means light. The word shraga is light, right? We use that for Hanukkah a lot. Now the Hanukkah's over. So instead of getting melons, he got 2 candles. So you could imagine at this point, he was fit to be tied. Zilu Tavri Yason al Resha Debava. He got so upset at her, he said, go take these candles and smash them on the head of Bava. Now the word Bava, we know the word Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, in Aramaic means a gate. So he basically said, take these and shove it. Go take the candles and smash them on the gate. So she goes outside. Have a Yosef Bava ben Buta Abava. Coincidentally, there was a rabbi by the name of Bava ben Buta who was actually sitting at the gate of their door. Right? Notice the word Bava. The Kada'in Dina, and he was in the middle of a Din Torah. Who is this Bava ben Buta? We'll see in a second. Azlas Vitavris Yasun al Resha. So she wanted to do exactly what her husband commanded, right? If you ever read the book when you were younger, right? They call it Amelia Bedelia, right? That's what everybody at this point should be thinking. And this is the original. Remember how we say that everything is in the Talmud? So that's why I figured we do this last, to show that, in fact, even Amelia Bedelia is in the Talmud. So she smashes it on Bav ben Buta's head. So Amrullah, he said to her, hey, Mahadin Da'avdis. Again, he was in the middle of the Din Torah. All of a sudden, someone clocks him on the head with 2 candles. He says, hey, what's going on? So Amrullah, so this woman said, this is what my husband told me to do. Unbelievable. Have you ever heard of a story like this? Amar, he said, Ata sitritzon ba'alech. So there's 2 ways he could have handled it. Okay, you see where I'm going with this. He said, you did the will of your husband. Hamakom yotzi mimcha shnei banim kabava ben buta. God shall reward you because you listened to your husband, even though you didn't even know what he was talking about. You should have 2 children like Bava ben Buta, me. Okay, so that's the story. This story happens to be whenever there's a humor in the Talmud, shir, which maybe we'll do one day. By the way, the reason why humor and comedy is so important is actually Gemara in Arvei Psachim that says that there was a certain Amora that would start each shir off with a joke. Like, if we didn't see that in the Talmud, we would never believe it. But just like every speech starts with a joke, if you ever heard a sermon on Shabbos, there's always something that starts off, right, a speaker in order to grab the attention. Warren Tynus also says that. Thank you. Right, in order to grab the attention of the crowd, the rabbi usually makes some corny joke about a rabbi and a priest in a bar or whatever the context is, right? But it's important to lighten people's mood. And this is one of those stories that made it to show that, once in a while, a little humor is good for the soul. I wanted to, right, 21 is the people who would make people happy. Right, the Badchan at the wedding, the Gemara says that they have schar, right, making people happy, like clowns, for example, in a hospital. There's a whole discussion about that, how they have great schar, right? If you belittle yourself, right, in order to make someone happy, the Gemara also in Ksuvas Yud Zayin, where it talks about Ketzad Maraktim, they do all kinds of things that would belittle them for the moment, but to produce laughter and excitement and joy at a simcha is, the Gemara says, is an awesome zechus. So I wanted to end off by another Ben Yehoyada, okay? Because everybody, well, not I'm supposed to say everybody, the name Bava ben Buta might ring a bell. Bava ben Buta appears, I believe, 3 times in Shas. One other time he appears is in the beginning of Maseches Bava Basra. Okay, we're going to get to that in a second. Let's look at the Ben Yehoyada. This Ben Yehoyada comes from Maseches Bava Basra, and he says, what is so special about Bava ben Buta? The Gemara over there says that Hordus, okay, actually was given advice from Bava ben Buta to take off some of the Beis to demolish some of the Beis Hamikdash and actually rebuilt it. If you've been to Herodian in Israel and given the story about Hordus, you know that Hordus redecorated a lot of the redecorated a lot of the Beis Hamikdash through the advice of Bava ben Buta. And because the Gemara in Bava Basra talks about knocking down shuls, whatever, there's a discussion about if you can knock down a shul before you raise money for a new one, and it goes into a tangent on Daf Gimel, if you remember. And the Gemara says that Hordus, when he rose to become a king, he wasn't so accepted by everyone, but he heard a bas kol, and Hordus became who he was, and he was actually a slave. Okay, and the Gemara goes through a whole story, and in the end, Hordus had a lot of opposition, and he killed out most of the Rabbanon, except one person. He left one man by the name of Bava ben Buta. So that's where Bava ben Buta became famous, not from our story. He became famous from the sole survivor of Hordus killing out all of the Rabbanon. Okay, because the Rabbanon said, hey, you can't be a king. The pasuk says, "Mikera v'achecha tasim alecha melech." You're not Jewish. You come from, your yichus is from Avadim. Okay, so they basically were opposed to him, and Bava ben Buta said, "Okay, I'll let it go," and that's how Bava ben Buta became famous. And over there, the Ben Yehoyada says, why is it? He says, Umasha Bachar Bava ben Buta Dafka. Why did he decide that Bava ben Buta was going to be the one to survive? What was it about Bava ben Buta? V'lo bezulato mipnei ki Bava ben Buta hayadua betivo she'eno nokem v'noter. You know what zechus Bava ben Buta had in order to survive the destruction that Hordus did and killed out all the rabbis? Because he wasn't a nokem v'noter. He didn't hold grudges. He would always forgive those who sinned to him. He would do the opposite. To those who did bad to him, he would do good to them. How do we know? So says the Ben Yehoyada, look at our Gemara in Nedarim. From the story of the candlesticks that got smashed on his head, what did he say? Right? So after the sticks got smashed on his head, right? So he goes through the whole story in Nedarim, how the husband was angry that his wife had this lapse of understanding, and he ended up smashing it on her head, right? And he says, what did he do? He gave a bracha at the end, right? He said, you did what your husband told you to do. Yehi ratzon that you have two sons like Bava ben Buta. So he says, Re'ei kama haya savlan, how much he was able to accept. The eno makbid u'mochel al kvodo. That's the key word over here. Bava ben Buta, he wasn't just a rabbi. What does the Gemara say he was doing? He was giving a class. He was doing a din Torah. He got smashed in the head while giving a din Torah, right? He was mochel on his kavod, v'shalo dailo shalo klala. Not only did he not curse her, ele baruche barachla. He gave her a bracha, b'kivan shahaya yaduo mefursam shehu mavir al midosa. That's the punchline over here. He did what the Gemara says one of the holiest and highest traits a person could have. Right? Remember the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Zayin? It says, Kol ha'maver al midosav, mochel al kol v'nosav. If you're able, right, to accept it and not dish it out, that is the highest madrega. So you're mochel on your kavod, and you're maver al midosav, laken bachar hordus l'shayir shelo lahargo. That's the zechus that Bava ben Buta had, according to the Ben Yehoyada, that he was spared by Hordus when he killed out all the rabbis. And I think that's a beautiful lesson from this very, very whimsical story that, like I said, sounds like a Laurel and Hardy, but the punchline, is that we see a great trait that we should all emulate. All right. Questions, comments?